Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from MisterWives called Connect the Dots. So I've talked a fair bit before about the whole idea of a silent majority act. Groups that critics tend to treat indifferently or ignore for being kind of bland and unchallenging, but attract a huge mainstream following for being just accessible enough to get airplay or a lot of sales, even if the buzz for the group was never really all that big or nobody really talks about them. But there's a flip side to this, and I'm struggling to come up with the right term. Maybe you guys can help me with this. These are for groups that typically sit near the underground but not quite in it, never really build up enough buzz to break through, and while critics tend to like them a decent bit when they release new material, they get good reviews, they also tend to get lost in the shuffle a little bit, never really getting a tremendous amount of attention, albeit they probably deserve a little more. They develop typically cult followings. Now, such was the case for MisterWives, an indie pop group I actually caught live opening for Bleachers back in 2014 before I actually reviewed their debut album a year later. And for the most part, I really quite liked that debut album, Our Own House. Now, sure, there were points that were a little uneven or overstated, but the energy and the vibrancy and the color made it clear this was a group that you should definitely be hearing. Hell, I even put the excellent closing track on that album, Queens, on my top 50 songs of 2015. And yet before this week, I wasn't even aware that MisterWives had a sophomore album ready and able to go, or that people on Patreon were so eager for me to cover it. That, to me, was pretty encouraging. I didn't have huge expectations going in, but if they had managed to refine some of the ideas and writing off that debut album while still keeping all those really big hooks and real momentum, this could be a lot of fun. I've been looking forward to a good indie pop album. So what did we find on Connect the Dots? Well, okay. This is one of those cases where it's always a good idea to take a little bit more time to re-listen to the album and truly think about it and give it those additional few spins. Because when I first heard this, I was ecstatic. Finally, the sort of indie pop that seems to incorporate every criticism I made of their sound and improve across the board. They fixed everything, bringing the energy and vibrancy that made their material so damn compelling on their debut. And yet, I had to take a step back from all the hype. I had to look again, consider things a little bit more carefully, take another day. And while I still think this is a great pop album that you should all definitely hear, I'm not quite as high on it as I was a couple days ago when I first heard it. Because while this is definitely an improvement from their debut, there are a couple flaws that really can't be ignored. But again, great album. But before we get to those flaws, I want to address what many people will mischaracterize as a flaw on this album, and I think will be ultimately misunderstood, and that's the mood and tone. Quite frankly, following the wake of Our Own House, this record can be chipper and upbeat almost to an alarming level, kind of reminiscent of the pop music around the turn of the millennium that so many people have come to appreciate nowadays in my generation, at least ironically. But irony, that would be the last word I would use to describe Connect the Dots. My main impression from the production to the writing to especially the delivery is that MisterWives is a band that loves writing about and being an indie pop act with a ton of straightforward, earnest exuberance. Hell, with the horns and the big catchy hooks and the multi-track vocal harmonies, you could easily trace a lineage for MisterWives to acts like, say, S Club 7. And again, coming from me, that's a compliment. And while this is a record that feels modern enough to fit within the typical indie pop scene and has some similar tropes, they've got a great drummer. I have no idea why they feel the need to inject some of the more programmed beats, and there is a little bit too much reverb in spots, but they've also cleaned up several of the issues that I had with their debut album, most notably a much greater emphasis on strong guitar lines that bring some spiky new wave flavor that's got all the color that Paramore's After Laughter, that last album, that it lacked. And coupled with a mix that's a little bit more balanced in the mid-range, it can lead to some monster hooks, like the blaring stomp of Machine and Oh Love, the fantastic rolling grooves that anchor the title track and Chasing This, the bounce of Drummer Boy, even the very earnest, slow swell of My Brother with a fantastic final hook, which, in a funny way, kind of reminded me a little bit of their tour mates Bleachers, with some of the references between the lines. It almost seemed like a reference and message of hope passed along to that frontman Jack Antonoff. And you know what? That gave it some weight for me. Even if it's not quite true about them, or maybe intended for somebody else, I kind of like to imagine that it is. Now, on the flip side, when the record does have so much forward momentum, the parts that can seem a little bit flabby or stutter a little can get a bit distracting, like the slightly wonky groove on the pre-chorus of Only Human, for instance. And yet, even without those, just like on Our Own House, house, it can be an overwhelming or even exhausting listen. Most because MisterWives aren't exactly being subtle here, which can be kind of exasperating because especially when you look at the vocals from Mandy Lee, you know they've got the capacity for it. Granted, it's not exactly helped by the fact that her particular style of husky delivery has been adopted by so many modern and mainstream pop singers. There's a lot of people who sound like her nowadays, but I'd argue that she does it better mostly through dogged commitment, a lot of multi-tracking, and the desire to ramp up some real rock intensity, and the filters actually kind of work. She doesn't need them, but they don't hurt things either. But again, that sort of huge earnest energy can be kind of draining, especially when you start digging into the content and realize that for as much as MisterWives makes their story seem infectious, it can feel a little flimsy outside of it. Granted, you can tell that there's insight and self-awareness between the lines. This is a decent indie pop group, but what I think holds back these huge pop songs from real transcendence for me is that additional step or moment or thought to really refine things. Take for instance Revolution, one of two songs along with the better track Oh Love that feels positioned in the aftermath of the election down south in the States. And while in both cases you can tell they don't really have the answers and that they're so sick of being gaslit by people telling them just to calm down, things are back to normal, the big commitment to these anthems can make them feel a little lacking in overall direction. Similar case for Out of Tune Piano, where again, they seem acutely aware of how weird it can feel to mine personal emotional pain for artistic profit, and how it can yet have a complementary emotional impact on somebody. It can benefit somebody's life, but the fact that they anchor it in a big love yourself hook can feel a little, well, basic in more than one sense. Compare this to Machine, which you can very well feel like your standard anti-industry, we're doing things our way song, but it actually goes a step deeper and highlights that said industry builds pop groups to fall out of style and engineers a timeline for them, whereas MisterWives, they want to stick around. But as I said, MisterWives is an indie pop group and it loves writing about being an indie pop group, and you got a fair number of songs about that, along with straightforward love songs because Mandy Lee is in love with the drummer here, and you can tell that they gain the most thrill from this material. It's a little self-obsessed, sure, but it fits the very millennial style of this band. From the naked earnestness to the production trying to intensify the weights to the complete abandonment of any sort of irony. And it can feel a little bit simplistic in its approach, a little too single-minded at points. Yeah, sure, but there is something charming about that sort of earnest passion and the ability to tilt towards sincere bombast that, yeah, that really clicks for me, especially in pop. This does not feel like pandering for me. It feels like it comes from a real place. I can see this record falling to the exact same territory as that last Fox's album, All I Need, that I covered last year, and I really liked it. And as such, it's getting a light 8 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation from me, especially if you're a fan of much of the pop that I described, and especially if you like that first MisterWives album. This one's a lot better. But honestly, this is the direction that I'd love to see more pop go in the mainstream. Sincere, melodic, reasonably smart, catchy as hell. Definitely advise you check this out. It's so worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the link in the description below. I highly recommend you guys pick this up. It's going to get overlooked by a lot of people. I don't want that to happen. It's so much fun. Beyond that, I got the poll up here. I'm curious where more MisterWives fans fall on this. I think a lot of them have been pretty much unanimous in liking it, but I'm curious where you find. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in that Patreon that I discussed before, link to that is right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, which is going really well as of now. And beyond that, once per week, the higher tiers get to add records to my schedule. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.